This is Laura London, and you're listening to Speaking of Jung. Joining me today for episode 41 is Jungian analyst, author, and lecturer, Dr. Robert Tyminski. He first earned a master's degree in health and medical sciences from the University of California Berkeley, and then went on to receive a doctorate in psychology and mental health from the University of California, San Francisco. From 1987 to 2001, he served as executive director of San Francisco's Oaks Children's Center, a therapeutic day school for children and adolescents with emotional and autism spectrum disorders. During that time, he obtained a second master's degree in business administration from Berkeley. Dr. Tyminski completed his analytic training at the C.G. Jung Institute of San Francisco, where he later went on to serve as president from 2014 to 2016, and now teaches in their analyst training program. He is also currently a clinical professor in the Department of Psychiatry at UC San Francisco. He is a review editor for the Journal of Analytical Psychology and is the 2015 recipient of their Michael Fordham Prize for his article Lost in Cyberspace: Finding Two Adolescent Boys Hiding from Their Own Humanity. Later this year, he will be delivering the talk Apocalyptic Themes in Times of Trouble, When Young Men Are Deeply Alienated, at the 21st Congress of the International Association for Analytical Psychology in Vienna. His first book, The Psychology of Theft and Loss, Stolen and Fleeced, was published by Routledge in 2014. And his latest book, Male Alienation at the Crossroads of Identity, Culture, and Cyberspace, was published by Routledge in December, and it is the subject of our talk today. This interview is being recorded on Wednesday, February 20th, 2019, through the magic of Skype. Hi, Dr. Tyminski.
Hi there. Thank you for the lovely introduction.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. I'm very interested, first of all, in your education. You have 2 master's degrees and a doctorate, and you went through the training program to become a Jungian analyst, which is quite an ordeal in and of itself. So if you would tell us a little bit about your background and what led you to wanting to become a Jungian analyst?
So I think probably the best way to answer that is to do it somewhat chronologically, although that could be a bit of a rote thing too. But so I got into this program. It actually was a joint program between UC Berkeley and UCSF called the Doctor of Mental Health program. And it was a very innovative program for its time, very psychoanalytically oriented in terms of the theory and the treatment approach that we used in working with patients. But we also learned a lot about psychopharmacology. And while we were in training, we actually could write scripts and orders for psychiatric, medications, for lab tests, and that kind of thing. As you can imagine, this was a bit of a hot potato in terms of the professions duking it out. And so the program lasted from 1973 to 86.
Okay.
And after I graduated, there was a big question mark about how we would be licensed. At one point, the hope had been that we would get something called a limited medical license, which is kind of what optometrists have, and podiatrists as well, and that it would just apply to working, in psychiatric situations with patients and prescribing psychotropic medications. And that sort of never quite made it off the launch pad in California. And so we ended up being adopted, I think you could say, by the Board of Psychology. And most of us who have been in clinical practice went on to become licensed as psychologists. And during that time, I of course, I met some Jungian analysts. I had some supervision with some really terrific analysts, and just really liked kind of the openness of the Jungian approach, and felt like, there was something fundamentally more alive and qualitatively different about it from what I was learning about psychoanalysis, the more Freudian tradition.
Okay.
And so I began an analysis with a Jungian, and those sorts of things shape us really strongly. And so when it became time for me to think about what I was going to do with my career, I worked in this therapeutic school, as you mentioned in your intro, for 14 years. And I tell people that was probably 7 years too long.
Okay.
It was a very intense setting, and many of the experiences I had with particularly with boys, therapeutically, and trying to understand, some of the tragedies and traumas that they had gone through, comes from that experience over that period of time.
When you were there, you were practicing as a clinical psychologist.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I had a lot of administrative duties, but I started the training program there. So we then began to take graduate students in psychology who would come to the center and do either a year or two of what's called a practicum or an internship. And so I did a fair amount of supervision and teaching, and I occasionally saw some of the kids in therapy myself. Usually that was covering for one of our wonderful clinicians who was going on a maternity leave.
Okay.
And then when I finished, kind of my time there, I thought, well, I'm going to apply to the Jung Institute in San Francisco. And I really had a desire at that point to become an analyst. I liked my experiences that I had with the analysts here in San Francisco. And I also liked the kind of the approach that they took toward training, and which, was really a very, very rewarding experience for me.
When you were working as a clinical psychologist, you were primarily working with children. Is that correct?
Primarily, yes. Yeah. So during that period that we're talking about, definitely children. I had a small private practice, in which I saw just adults. But that was, probably like what we would call like a little bit less than a quarter-time practice, because I had a full-time job.
You had a full-time job working with the children and adolescents at the Oaks Children's Center. And so my question for you, though, is when you decided to enter the training program at the Jung Institute in San Francisco to then eventually practice as a Jungian analysts don't typically see children. So was that a choice that you made, where you wanted to then start seeing adults in your practice and not children anymore?
A really good question. That's one of the kind of gems about the San Francisco Institute, is that there are a fair number of analysts who work with adolescents and children. And we actually have a child an adolescent certification. You have to get your adult certification first, but you can also be certified as a child and adolescent analyst in San Francisco.
Okay, is that something that is just at the San Francisco Institute? Because one of the other things I wanted to talk to you about is specifically the Jung Institute of San Francisco, because I've never had an analyst on the podcast before, who trained there. And so I was hoping that you would, and you served as president there too. So I was hoping you would tell all of us a little bit about that institute.
Mm-hmm.
And this is one of the things that's maybe unique about it.
Yeah, it is there. I don't know the exact number of child programs that you worldwide that are affiliated with Jungian institutes, but it's no more than a handful. So we're talking about probably less than five. And so you're correct that this is a rare kind of a rare bird, and so. So that is something that is part of the San Francisco Institute. And so I did not have to make the choice of, in quite the way that your question, like what you were asking about, like, would I have to, then reorient myself away from children and adolescents to adults? Right now in my practice, it's about 50-50. So about half of my practice are children and adolescents and the other half are adults.
And you're seeing them analytically.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes. So you're looking at their dreams and their fantasies and discussing things symbolically with them.
Absolutely. And talking a fair amount too about the relationship, the analytic relationship, sort of in terms of transference and countertransference, which is the jargony words for what happens in the room between us. And then also with children, I have a sand tray that many of the children use, and that's a technique again that our institute in particular has really solid analysts who represent that tradition.
Would you say a little bit about that sand play?
Yeah, so Dora Kalf, who I believe had an analysis with Jung in Zurich, she worked with children and in Zurich, and she wanted to develop a method based on Jung's ideas. And I believe the story goes that she had a sandbox in her garden, and she noticed children playing in it, and so she was very intrigued about like whether or not that could be modified into something that you could use in a consulting room or a therapist's office. And so she developed this really process and technique that you have to have figurines. So you have to have a collection of small figurines that represent sort of almost like different archetypal ideas. So in my office, there's a fair amount of knights and princesses and cavemen and cave women and animals of all different kinds. And so the children, on occasion, some of the adolescents and adults I work with use this too, will create a scene in the sand tray. And so the idea being that almost has a dreamlike aspect to it, that you're encouraging a dream in the waking life in a way. And that what you see represented is often says something about where the psyche is at and what the person may be kind of either struggling with or just trying to break through to.
So is it sort of a picture that is created in the sand tray, or is it an acting out of a scene?
It can be both. I mean, a lot of times the way I usually introduce it is to say you're going to make like a scene or a world, and we will see what happens. And so boys tend to make, in my practice at least, tend to make the scene, and then I take a quick snapshot of it, and so that I have a record, and then they'll often ask, "Oh, can I play with the figures now?" And of course, they can play with the figures, and so then they create. It's almost always a battle scene, I can say. So.
Right, and then you sort of break that down the way that you would a dream.
I think of it that way, yes, and I don't usually interpret much about it, but I often, it's usually very, very helpful. It has an expressive function for the person doing it. So it's a way to get something out of the mind. and to be able to have it be witnessed by another person. So it has a nice kind of analytic holding function that way. And it's expressive. And then for me or another analyst or therapist using this, it's a way to also kind of get a sense of, oh, so that's what's going on. So I can give you a quick example, which would be that a boy I've been seeing for a few months now, his first tray, I won't go into a whole lot of detail, but in the center of it, he put there's a mummy coffin that I bought at some museum, and he put that in the middle. And so I thought, well, that's kind of interesting that he put that in the middle. And I think all I would need to tell you about this boy is that in the past few months, he was diagnosed with a pretty serious chronic illness. And you could think that loss would be something going on for him. And so when I saw that coffin in the middle of the sand tray, because it really didn't bear any much relationship to the rest of what was going on in the sand tray, I thought, wow, that is really giving me a lot of data about just how much that is something about having lost health, lost his childhood. That's really weighing on this boy's mind.
And that's something else that I love about Jungians and Jung's psychology and the work we do in analysis is looking at things symbolically and not literally. And you have a YouTube channel and you've got 3 videos up there, and I'll put links to all of those on Dr. Tyminski's podcast page. This episode page. One of the things that I noticed about you that I love is how you have this ability to look at things symbolically. And my analyst was so great at that. And she would say things that I never would have thought of before. And so instead of seeing that coffin and looking at it as a coffin, you looked at it symbolically. And it's not about a literal coffin or a literal death. Oh, this boy's going to die. Right?
Right. No. Yeah.
And that's something that I want to emphasize every time I can about how Jungian psychology is a little different from other forms of psychology, is because we're looking at things symbolically. And speaking of that, another thing that I heard you say, and I think this is in the book too, is that symptoms are trying to direct a person towards something. So is that another thing that maybe you look at when you're, and I also wanted to ask you, with the sand tray, is it always a rectangle or is it ever a circle?
Yeah. So the sand tray is a rectangle, and it's a specific dimensions. And again, this goes back to the Dora Kalf, and she really thought that it kind of had to be a certain size. This is my understanding of it, and so I should qualify. I'm not really an expert in sand play. There are plenty of them out there. But that she wanted it to be these certain dimensions for a couple of reasons. One of which is that when you look at it, it kind of captures the perceptual field. And then also, secondly, that it's not so overwhelming. So it's not too big, and that you have to fill it with everything. Right. And the advantage with it being a rectangle is it does kind of invoke something about a mandala. And so you have the 4 sides, and you can sort of use that in a kind of way to think about, well, what might be going on with some of the spatial aspects of the psyche. In other words, what's in the center? what's off to the side, what's in a corner, what gets buried. And so I think that there were several reasons that she kind of, decided on that particular shape. The other part of what you were just asking me about, thinking about symptoms, Jung had this word, he liked using Greek and Latin a lot, and so he used telos, which I think translates as purpose. And so he very much saw the telos, or the purpose in a symptom, as very, very important to understand. And so that the symptom isn't just an expression of pain and suffering, but it's also trying to call attention to something that is trying to heal. And part of an analyst or a therapist's job, if you're working in a depth model, is to try and really see that there's something inside there that's looking to be communicated, and to try and help the person find that.
Yes. Which is not always an easy thing to do.
No. I think in my book, I use this idea of the house as a metaphor. So, that you can think of the psyche, or our psyche, as a bit like a house.
Yes.
And so the question would be, what kind of a house is it? Is it one that you have easy access to? Is it one that has locked rooms? Is it one that's not furnished? Is it one that all the shades are pulled down? And all those ways of thinking about it say something about like what's going on inside a person, and how much do they feel they can share about that. And so I think that house metaphor, it's kind of an extension in a way of Cal's sand tray, except that it's also vertical, a little bit more vertical, but it's another way to think about a person's mind.
And there's an attic, right? And there's a basement. So I'm pretty familiar, because I often dream about being in a huge house that's unfamiliar. It's not my house. So, we've had a field day with that. Okay. So speaking of the book, which is titled Male Alienation at the Crossroads of Identity, Culture, and Cyberspace, its focus is on alienation. And when I first saw the title, I was thinking of boys and men, young boys, adolescents, men, even older men, being kind of alienated from the outer world. And you, of course, being an analyst, are also talking about the inner world and what can happen when there's a refusal to explore, one's inner world, one's inner life.
Yes.
If you would briefly give us a synopsis of the book, and then we'll break it down into the various themes that you delve into in the book.
Sure. So I think, one way to do this would be to talk about, why boys and men. And so some of that has to do, of course, with my clinical experience, but there have been so many reports, and they all take, have titles like Men Adrift, or Failing Our Boys, or The Next Male Generation is in Trouble, those sorts of things. And if you look at just statistics, and I don't want to kind of, encumber people with too much of that, but for example, 93% of inmates and prisoners are male. Yeah. That's an incredibly high number. 79% of murder victims worldwide are male. 66% of suicides worldwide are male. In the U.S., men are twice as likely to have substance dependence issues as women, and boys as girls. And so those numbers aren't just aberrations. They're saying something about the male psyche.
And also what's been in the news lately, unfortunately, are these mass shootings. I don't think any of them were done by females.
None of them were done by women.
And I just want to make a note here. If anyone is interested in statistics, you do cover a lot in the book. You cite lots of articles and news sources, and there are a lot of numbers in the book if anybody's interested.
Yes, thank you. So I kind of started to compile these numbers and started to think, what is going on here with these boys and men? And there were two things I would say that I kind of got onto. One was hearing a lot about video games. I know much more now about various video games than I would have ever elected to want to know. I've never played any of these games myself, so that's a full disclaimer.
Yeah, I haven't either.
And I often tell the boys and young men will often ask me, have you played this? And I'll say no, but keep telling me about what your experience is as you play it. And what I was hearing was something about these scenarios that, again, had almost a dreamlike quality to them, but felt a bit apocalyptic.
Right.
And so people were just being decimated. The landscapes were totally ruined. Often, people were fighting one another and scavenging to try and escape various monsters. And so I started to think about just this, what is this telling us, this kind of destructive fantasy life that can be so powerful that it's now a multi-billion-dollar industry that seems to be unstoppable. And so I started to think about that and did a bit of research on the idea of apocalypse, which is really quite an interesting word with a dual meaning.
Yes.
So it, on the one hand, can mean these doomsday scenarios, but originally apocalypse meant to reveal something. And I thought, well, that's interesting. We have the book of Revelation in the Bible where apocalypse is portrayed. But I had never made that and didn't know about that connection until I looked up the word apocalypse and found out, it's to reveal. That's why it's called Revelation and the last book of the Bible. Mm-hmm. And so that made me think again about what's trying to be revealed in these destructive fantasies. And the second thing that I really began to think a lot about was alienation. And some of that, I would say that a lot of times I heard young men or adolescent boys say, I feel alone or I feel isolated. But I began to also hear a lot, I'm broken. And I thought, well, that's an interesting word. Why are they saying broken? And the more I would listen and encourage them to talk about this word, I came to understand that it was like an umbrella for alienation, but not just the alienation from others, alienation from themselves. Mm-hmm. And so this began to really interest me, and I started to do more research. I started to think about different cases that I've worked with through the years, and I decided that when I was going to kind of create an outline for this book, that I would use the theme of apocalypse, but much more in the sense of trying to understand these different destructive urges that I had heard about and hear about in my practice, and what is it that again is trying to be communicated, because it's not just blanket destruction. I think in the book I try and break it down. I break it into 4 different categories, which is somewhat of a kind of a little bit of a writer's trick in a way, because there are probably more than 4 categories. Mm-hmm. But I use the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse as a way to break it down and say, okay, what is this one telling us? And what is that one telling us?
And with the apocalypse and the apocalyptic theme, and yes, I've noticed that too, especially more lately, more and more. And when these, what do I want to say? These, it's even made the mainstream news when there's some group out there that says that the end of the world is coming. And I remember in 2012, specifically December 21st, 2012 was
the Mayan.
was
it
end
the
of
Mayan?
the Mayan calendar. Yeah. And what was going to happen. And then there was Y2K, and was the world going to end in the year 2000? And so because I was in analysis at the time, I thought, well, we need to look at this symbolically, like I was saying before. This is an internal thing, right? What's going to end? What needs to die? What wants to die? So instead of externalizing it, am I on track here? Instead of externalizing it and saying the whole entire world is going to end, there's something in us that needs to maybe transform or die and be reborn as something else.
Yeah. I think that's a terrific way, Laura, to put it. I wish I had been that concise in my book because I think you really put it. I was just thinking about that. Yeah, that there is something with this fascination, and it's not just the hero archetype or the hero myth. It's something. It's too repetitive. In other words, if it were just the hero cycle, you would think that at some point it might approach an end. But the drive with which some of these destructive fantasies live on, I think you're right that there is something there in the psyche that's hidden and that's looking for an end and a new beginning.
Yeah.
But it's so obscured, and that again gets a little bit back to this idea of alienation from self. And that's also part of why I use that house metaphor, because a lot of times, like, I began to picture houses and, sitting with a young man, and what I was seeing was like no trespassing signs and the windows boarded up, the front door locked and bolted and probably like reinforced with steel bars on the inside. Yeah. And I just began to think, wow, what is it this person is missing out on? And what's in there that's so terrifying?
And that doesn't want to be seen.
Yeah. Hiding in some ways. And that's why that word, the meaning of apocalypse really hit me. Reveal. What's in there that really is unrevealed at this point, but needs in some way to be revealed.
And that is reminding me of another theme I saw recurring in the book is that of the anima, the feminine, and these male gender roles, and gender and identity are another thing that you cover in the book, but that boys have this fear that any of their feelings or internal states are just not manly. So that's something that needs to be hidden. They can't let anybody see. So I'd like you to talk about that.
Yeah, the inner world is very much again, like you think of the boarded up house with the no trespassing sign. That is a clear statement about like don't go there. The question would be why, and I think that's something that you're bringing up with masculinity and femininity, that there often for many boys is an understanding that looking inside themselves and that kind of way can be construed. And again, I can't tell you quite where these messages come from, but it's sociocultural, but that it can be construed as feminine, that there's some way about talking about feelings in a more internal way, that a lot of boys feel that potentially can diminish them. And so there's a lot now, of course, in the news about and in a very, I think, positive way about toxic masculinity. It's a conversation that we need to have and be having. But it tends to be defined. I mean, I have patients now who will come in and bring it up and start talking about it as if it's already defined. And one of the things that I do is I try and say, well, let's slow down a little bit. You're using that idea, toxic masculinity. Let's see if we can unpack it. Tell me what you think that means. And it'll be interesting to hear. But often it's clearly associated with something about appearing effeminate, appearing weak, appearing submissive. And that those things are so feared that the idea of the toxic masculine is to overpower, to be dominant, to be homophobic, to be misogynistic, and that somehow that cloak it has a very protective function. And so you think about someone, a male who's got that mindset. And you have to ask yourself, how readily are they going to want to look inside? Because calling all that into question, that's like, that's the house built out of straw in a way. And so there's a bit of a problem when men are so, and boys are so kind of slipping into that mindset of, this is what I need to do and think and be in order to be male. And those messages are really are something that don't just come from the family. They really permeate at a cultural and social level.
So what can we do about that?
That's a great question. I think a lot of, some of the hopeful things that I see, like, so for example, having this conversation about what is toxic masculinity. I heard something recently in the New York Times about, fraternities that are trying to basically reform themselves and have college fraternities and have more of a positive model about what it means to be a man, so that they're including things like having friendship circles and, where the fraternity members would get together and just talk about tough things. That sounds to me like, oh my gosh, breath of fresh air, finally.
Yeah.
So those kinds of things I think are happening and are very positive signs. And yeah.
So would you, just going back to what we were talking about before about violent video games, the statistics that you rattled off on who's in jail, who's committing crimes, who's committing murder, who's doing these mass shootings, I guess I want to start getting at the root of all of this. So would you say that this fear of what's on the inside, maybe if someone a male is in touch with what's going on in the inside a little bit, or gets a glimpse of it and needs to squash that?
It's a big question what the root of it is. And
let me just say, I think I'm wondering why this fascination with violence. I mean, the video game industry is huge. Sports, football, NFL football is huge. Wrestling, things that are violent tendencies, our aggression is not. I think it's just we don't deal with it in a healthy way. So we need other people to act it out for us, or to engage with it and act it out sitting at our computer. And we haven't even started to talk about this whole cyberspace world where we're having relationships that aren't face to face and aren't, in person, and they're just fantasies. They're not real. And so we need to cover all of that too. So where could we go from here?
Well, as you were kind of talking there, it helped me to think a little bit about like where does it come from, and that seems like part of what I think is almost like a I don't want to call it a default or a design flaw, but it's just in us, is that we tend to split things. It's convenient. It makes it easier. It's cognitively and emotionally quick. And so, to be able to say good and bad is like much easier than dealing with ambiguity and like, well, this thing might be good sometimes, but bad other times. You know what I'm talking about there. And so that also applies to masculine and feminine. There is something that again, like in the psyche, that pulls for a polarization and a dichotomy, but it's a false dichotomy because masculine and feminine really coexist, and they're along a spectrum. They are not absolute binaries, but that is a hard piece to hold on to. And so I think almost like as a kind of cognitive and emotional shorthand, we slip into, oh, that's male, that's female. And that kind of thinking, you can just see like those some of those cultural tropes that you mentioned, like the NFL, the kind of not just the pro wrestling, but the fake pro wrestling, which again, like I've heard many young men and boys describe to me in detail, and there's something that pulls at a cultural level for that kind of separation too. And when we get stuck in that, then it really is difficult to see that this is a spectrum we're talking about, and that, each of us has male and female qualities in us. And how do we appreciate both of those things? That is hard to hold on to for an individual psyche. I mean, people can do it, obviously, and that's terrific. But you think about like for groups of people and for a whole society to do that, that's a bigger challenge.
In the first chapter of the book, you say that the book is really in 3 sections. And the first section is you're looking at what leads to and reinforces alienation from these internal states, right? Technology, how technology affects us, how the internet affects us. And I'd like you to speak a little bit about that. And then in the second section of the book, you're looking at external behaviors that emerge when we're talking specifically about boys and men, when they turn away from what's inside of them. And then in the third section of the book, you address how to deal with all of this in a clinical way, in a clinical setting. So chapters 2, 3, 4, you're looking at, again, the internal state. And chapter 2 is called Online Antics, Caught in the Web. And this is something that I just don't feel is addressed enough. And it caught my eye because I have some friends right now who are struggling with these types of relationships that are strictly online relationships. And I just see and hear the agony that they're going through. And you say that cyberspace is being used to negate relationships. And people are engaging in risky behavior around these fantasies. So I was wondering if you would talk some more about that.
Yeah, there's something about, what happens on these screens that we all use, and that, I think the saturation now is pretty close in this country to 100%. I mean, So you just, everybody, I always am amazed. I go here in San Francisco into a cafe, I'll sit down and I usually have a book with me, like a physical book.
Right.
And I'll look around and 90% of the people are on a screen.
Yeah.
And nobody's talking to one another.
Yeah.
And it's really, really interesting to just think about, like, that's a change in my lifetime. Because I remember going into those cafes not even 15 years ago, and you would sit down next to somebody, and if you had a book, they might say, well, what are you reading there? Oh, I've heard about that author, and you'd start up a conversation. So I think that something has happened in a pretty powerful way. And one of the things I try to flesh out is that I think that these screens flatten us. They flatten us emotionally and cognitively, and they create something like a transactional way of relating. And if you think about, and I'm using that almost in a business way. So it's about exchanges, but it's about pluses and minuses, and it's very binary. So to go back to, what I was just talking about a few minutes ago about male and female, it really pulls for polarization. And so that feels very, very problematic to me as an analyst, because it degrades the symbolic, like what you were saying, right, that people can't appreciate that this is a fantasy construction. And there's also a loss of an appreciation for otherness, because in that two-dimensional world, you're either a friend or not a friend, or you're either, alike or not alike, or you're, somebody who gives a thumbs up or a thumbs down. It's just very, very split. Yeah. And so the psychological risk, I think, when we're online a lot is that it pulls for splitting. So again, that kind of binary way of functioning, one category, another category, that's it. And those categories often don't have a bridge between them. It pulls for projection. In other words, what you were just describing earlier, alluding to your friends about, like, oh, this could be real. Maybe there's something real to this. And losing that capacity in a way to say, well, wait, this is me projecting a desire or a wish into something that probably isn't going to happen. And then, of course, a lot of denial, so that we can, I think the thing with these online communities is that we can each find an echo chamber, and we can exist in the echo chamber and find a certain comfort in that. But that if we don't venture out and see other things or listen to other things, then we kind of lose sight of, oh my gosh, there's different opinions, there's different people, there's different lifestyles, there's different kinds of families, there's all these differences that are submerged.
Yeah. I have a male friend who I've known for decades, who is around my age, and he lives alone, and he is as close of friends we are. He doesn't like talking about any of this stuff. He doesn't want to hear about Jung. He doesn't want to hear about psychology. He doesn't want to look at himself. And he'll say to me, Laura, I don't want to be analyzed. And not that I'm analyzing him, but, this stuff rubs off on me. So the way I talk, right? So he doesn't, he doesn't want to look at it. Yeah. So my question to you is, what are the consequences for him he says, I don't want to look at it. I just want to have my fantasy, leave me alone. Let me have my fantasy. I know it's not real, but this is what I'm going to do.
Yeah. Well, I don't know how old your friend is, but I can tell you from my practice that what I often have had happen is somebody in their 40s or 50s or 60s show up in my office, and rather than saying I'm broken, they'll say I've missed it.
Yeah.
And that's what your friend is putting at risk, is that he's missing out on something. And it's possible to go through life mostly unconscious, I suppose. But I think at some point, most of us have awakenings. And, sometimes those are triggered by deaths or loss of one form or another. And, when that happens, that can be, again, an extremely powerful moment where a man, might look back and see something about a closed off section of life, of inner life, and of choices that he forced upon himself because of his alienation from his inner life, that is overwhelming, that is really substantially overwhelming. At the beginning of the book, I use John Keats' poem "Ode on a Grecian Urn," and I was thinking, why the hell am I using this? It's old, it's schlocky in a way, and many of us had to learn it in high school. But there's really a beautiful part about like it's a man he's writing about who is just lost in the past. And it's more than nostalgia. It's like a kind of imprisonment. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's what your friend would be putting himself at risk for, would be that at some point, when an awakening might come, he would feel, I don't think just regret, but possibly even despair.
Chapter 3 is called Narcissists in the Locker Room, Sexuality and Gender. And in that chapter, you look at masculine ideals and stereotypes. And I thought it was interesting that you said that the myth of narcissist is maybe in general looked at a little wrongly, and that you kind of have a different take on it. I was wondering if you would say a little bit about that.
Yeah. So, part of why that chapter is entitled that is that there's so much posturing that can go on in male locker rooms where like this kind of they're almost like operatic displays. Where guys are trying to impress one another or talk, tough or talk trash with one another. You see this with boys too, and so that's kind of where the narcissus in the locker room idea comes from. Mm-hmm. But the narcissus myth itself, I've always found a kind of interesting, and so I've read mostly Ovid's retelling of it and Metamorphoses, and if you read it there, it's true that he is a bit of a self-absorbed, arrogant, probably not very likable youth. He's 16 in the myth. And so I just started to think about like what's going on here, and what might be some of the archetypal foundations for what this myth is telling us. And it does seem to be saying something about a kind of aloof masculinity in a teenage boy who does not want to interact with the feminine. So you could think of Echo, who's the character in the myth that Narcissus rejects. You could think of that as a rejection of the feminine in himself. In other words, she's a projected manifestation of that part of himself. Yeah. And so the myth seems to be saying something about a kind of young guy who is really not very internally oriented, but is also very much an adolescent. And so I think at the end of the myth, of course, he kind of wilts away, staring at his reflection in the pond. And it's interesting if you read the beginning of the myth, both of his parents were water creatures. The mother was, I think, a river nymph, and the father was a sea god. And so you think about, well, what is that? These myths are usually never coincidental. So in other words, that he ends up staring into the water at the end, and he's basically a water being himself. That I started to think about as a separation problem. That's saying something, and this happens a lot in adolescence, that if you can't get out of seeing yourself through your parents' eyes, then you're going to be in trouble. And so I think it's much more a myth about a kind of adolescent tragedy, if you will, or the risks that many of us go through in our adolescence. Archetypally, you could think about it as having a somewhat of a universal quality that it happens to most of us. And that it's not primarily then a myth about, narcissism as a kind of personality pathology. Yeah. Freud in his paper where he writes about narcissism never references the myth. And I think that's a curious omission because Freud read myths. He loved mythology. In his office, he had like these collection of Egyptian statues from, Egyptian antiquity. And so I just started to think about, well, what's being omitted here? So he took something, and he did see something in that one scene, right, where Narcissus basically is so self-absorbed that he neglects to take care of himself and ends up dying. Yeah. So he did see something in that one scene, but it's just a scene in the whole story. There's a lot of background to it.
Thank you for sharing that alternate way of looking at that myth. I thought that was very interesting. Again, that's in chapter 3. Chapter 4 is titled Breaking It, at a Loss for Words. And that's where you talk about just boys and their bad communication around feelings.
Yeah, absolutely. And part of how I got to this is, again, like hearing all these stories about boys breaking things, and mostly adolescent boys in the sense of you'd think that they cognitively have some capacity to communicate how they're feeling, and often don't, and instead end up in these situations where they put their fist through the wall, right, or they break a window, or they crash a car or something like that. And so I started thinking about like what are all these breaking instances telling us, and are telling, potentially parents and teachers and therapists, and that there often is something about a reluctance to use feeling toned words, and it sometimes extends beyond just a reluctance to an inability to do that.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, right? Is it that they don't want to, or that they just don't know how?
It's both. It's both. Yeah. It's fascinating in the sense that, I give an example, and I think all the examples are very intelligent guys, well-educated. The youngest, I think, is 15, and the oldest in that chapter might be like in his early 20s. And, like the one guy, I said to him at one point, one of the older ones, I said, you sound depressed. And he looked at me flummoxed, and he said, depressed? And I said, yeah. And I just kind of described to him what I was seeing and why I thought that. And he looked at me and he said, what does that mean, depressed? Wow. And he really didn't quite get what it would mean to feel depressed. And so I realized, I kind of made a wrong assumption. I thought he would know that, and I need to back up and kind of do this a little differently with him and talk about, why I'm seeing these things and maybe how he's feeling about these different things, and sort of take it in a way very, very rudimentary about, like, maybe there's something about using words like sad and lonely, grieving, that he doesn't quite know how to link up with his experience. Mm-hmm. And he found that very useful, I should say. This particular guy was able to work that way and was able to start making those connections. And, at one point, a relative of his came down with a very serious illness, and it looked like that relative, it was a distant relative, might pass away. And he came in and he actually said, the thought that this guy might die, he's just a little older than I am. He said, it makes me so sad. And he started to cry, and I thought, oh my gosh, it worked, we got there. And so that would be like the how piece, and the reluctance piece is much more, would be much more about, like, again, like what we were talking about somewhat earlier, about like not wanting to go there. Mm-hmm. No trespassing, in other words, there's a big sign on the door.
Yeah. And chapter 5 is titled Alienation and Identity, Immigration, Race, and Ethnicity. And in that chapter, you talk about outcasts, rebels, loners, and slackers.
Right. Yeah. These would be all kind of, questions that come up when you feel a difference and you feel that somehow you're marginalized, mm-hmm. discriminated against, not seen. These are all different aspects, I think, to race, culture, language, religion, all these kind of, in many ways, they're such hot issues for us now. But they really press on different things around the question of who am I? How do others see me? How do I see myself? Can I communicate how I see myself to others so that they can see me better? And those kind of questions, I think, can be dicey if mixed up in that you don't want to look much inside yourself.
In the United States, we're becoming more and more and more integrated, right? I think that the population of different ethnicities, different races is just increasing. Mm-hmm. So I would think, maybe because I'm thinking about this more logically, I would think that it was becoming easier and easier for people to, quote, fit in.
Yeah.
What's your experience?
I don't say, I wish I could say, I can say yes, in the sense, again, that the millennial generation, I think, is going to move us forward in a surprising way around these issues. Yeah. But I hear, still, and I live in a very tolerant, liberally progressive area of the country, and what I still have patients come in, and teenagers, for example, who might be gay or bi or trans, mm-hmm. and they'll be afraid, and they'll be afraid because they've heard some of their classmates say derogatory slurs against those communities. And
I have got to ask you, is that still as prevalent as it was when I was in school, which going back decades now? Is that still the case? I just thought we were becoming a more tolerant society.
Yeah. I hope we are, and I believe we are, but there still is a lot of widespread homophobia, racism. It's that binary trap that we've been talking about, where and the binary there is us and them. So it's really a way to create an experience of alienation, but it's through a person's subjugating the other and marginalizing them. Okay. And so when that's happening, and it still does happen, I have gay patients who still are called fag in certain settings, and I was a young African American man. I was working with a teenager last year, and he came in one day, and this was a really sweet guy. I really liked this guy a lot. And he came in one day and he was upset, and I asked him what had happened, and he said, well, there was an older white couple on the street, and he was pretty sure that when they saw him, they crossed the street. Aww. And so again, this is in San Francisco. So I don't think he imagined that, and it's of course possible he misperceived something, but I didn't. My sense is these things do still happen. Yeah. They happen at a nonverbal level, except of course when people are using verbal slurs. Right. But the nonverbal level can hurt as much as the verbal slurs. Sure. I guess that would be what the takeaway might be from what we were just discussing.
Sure. And I'm sorry to the audience for going through this so quickly, and for changing the subject so rapidly, but we only have so much time, and I'm trying to get Dr. Tyminski to talk about as much as he possibly can within our allotted time. So I'm going to move on to chapter 6, which is called Alienated Monsters Cut Loose. And that's when you look at the violence in video games and gun violence and violence online. And I would also add that you talk about the concept of contempt, which I thought was absolutely fascinating, about how toxic it is. And when we express it instead of process it, and it's just that it's not me, it's them kind of thinking.
Yes. Yeah. No, I think, for the sake of, maybe just keeping us with that one thought, the contempt is so toxic. I mean, if you talk to anybody whose practice is primarily doing couples or marriage therapy or counseling, they will tell you that when contempt is palpable and too openly communicated in a couple, it's a pretty good indicator that couple is likely not going to make it.
So what's at the root then of contempt that we're I don't want to answer. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I don't, I don't know that there's an easy answer to that, but often contempt is thought of as something that originates from early shaming experiences, and that when we're shamed in particularly humiliating ways at a young age, that leaves an indelible mark on us, and that later on when we misperceive ideas or interactions where we suspect that there could be a possibility or a risk of shaming, that we react with contempt. Yeah. In other words, to devalue the other person, to devalue the situation, and to protect ourselves.
Mm-hmm. And why did you call this chapter Alienated Monsters Cut Loose? What do you mean by monsters?
Yeah, I like Frankenstein a lot, and I think Frankenstein is one of the great stories of alienation, not just because he's a monster, but because of how we misunderstand the title. So Frankenstein was actually Victor Frankenstein and not the creature. the creature had no name and was just called the creature.
Mm-hmm.
But somehow in our minds, we've kind of conflated the two. And I think that story really says something again about what it feels like when you're marginalized and humiliated, that you then feel you have these experiences of wanting revenge and rage. And rage fueling the fantasy for revenge. And so when you get that dynamic kind of going on, you're in very, very risky territory. That in other words, that there's something about those shaming experiences that have fueled so much contempt that it then cuts the person off from others. It cuts the person off from perceiving himself and others as part of humanity, and that then these sort of reckless, very, very dangerous, destructive things can get acted out.
Chapter 7, Accidents that Become Catastrophes. You discuss pursuing thrills through things like drugs and sex and recklessness with vehicles and sports.
Yeah, this is partly has to do with something about alienation from being able to, again, look inside yourself and understand that when you're upset, if you don't have a way to modulate that you can put yourself in risky situations mm-hmm. where totally unexpected things can happen. And the example I give at the beginning of that chapter, which I could, you couldn't have made these things up. I mean, that's like, right. I don't know, like, that I would be a particularly good fiction writer at this point in my life because I've heard so many stories, and I'm just like, so this real. young man, went on a road trip with a friend of his and came back in one of the boons. You could think of this as like him acting out some piece of a hero's journey, like going off on his first road trip. Boons. And one of the boons he brings back is a tattoo. And he pulls down his shirt, his T-shirt, to show me that he has gotten a tattoo of the Grim Reaper on his chest over his heart. Mm-hmm. And I was floored. Yeah. I'm sure my jaw dropped. And I said to him, "Do you know what that is?" Right. Like I'm sure he started to laugh. He was like, "Rob," he called me Rob. He was like, "Rob, of course I know who that's the death guy, And within a month, this young man got in a car crash where his car was totaled, and he survived, but he had a fantasy that by having that tattoo, that he was protected. Yeah. From these.
What do you think of that?
Well, it's magical thinking in some sense, right? We all have it's like some aspect of the lucky rabbit's foot, or throwing salt over your shoulder or something like that. It really was a kind of superstitious belief he had that by and in this particular case, I explain it more in the book. He had a very traumatic early childhood with abuse, physical abuse from parental figures, and so when I saw that, I thought, oh no, that's not good. I mean, I literally thought that, and I didn't say it to him because, of course, I would never put it that way. But my thinking was he's saying something about like he's identifying with those aggressors. He's identifying with those people who hurt him so badly, and in a way frightened him to death when he was 4 years old and 5 years old. So I think when he said that, it was his way of trying to work around something about his own early history, looking for some magical solution to not have to face that. Yeah, he's a guy who probably needs to be a little bit more careful about what he puts himself into, the situations.
Now, what would you say to me seeing it as he's constellated the opposite by putting the Grim Reaper on his chest, by sort of inviting death in that, through that totem, that symbol, that he constellated the opposite?
Yeah, it's an interesting idea, and certainly I could see some meaning to that. I mean, clearly for him, it would be something about like the potential, right, for a death to happen, and at a point in his life where he was moving more into adulthood. You could think of it that way. I think for me, what overrode or would override that kind of idea is knowing about his early traumatic history and abusive history, and thinking the risk of identifying with an aggressor in your unconscious is that you could put yourself into dangerous situations where either your life is at stake, somebody kills you, or you kill someone else. I mean, I have seen this happen, so I think that's part of why I felt frankly alarmed, and when I saw that.
Sure. And then in chapter 8, you talk about fathers. It's titled, What Our Fathers Gave Us. And you look at the father's role in the son's development, whether the father was present or not. We all have a father. And so we have an internal father. Right.
We all do. And if we, that's one of Jung's great insights about the archetypes and the collective unconscious is if we're not somewhat conscious of that internal father, he's there anyways.
Yeah. And then in chapter 9, you look at, this is toward the end of the book. The last 2 chapters, you're looking at how clinicians can help, right? So chapter 9 is called I'm Broken.
Right.
And you go over some strategies and some of the obstacles to treatment. And in chapter 10, it's called Revealing a Boy, and you look at how to help them heal. Yeah.
And I try to bring it back to that apocalypse in the revealing, right, meaning. So that's partly why I use that word, revealing a boy. And I think, for a certain group of men, that boy is a very, very important figure. He's often lost in the unconscious. He's a boy that the man or the, even an older, say, teenager might have this experience, doesn't want to remember and wishes were gone because it's associated with something painful. And so that idea of being able to reclaim that boy and understand something about him, I think is almost like a bit of the male soul. And so that's why I kind of try to introduce the idea that anima nowadays maybe doesn't have to be a gendered concept, that it could show up in multiple kinds of ways. And so for some guys, some men, and some boys, it might actually be a masculine figure rather than what Jung thought that it would have to be a feminine one.
But did Jung say that anima meant soul? So the soul in a man?
Would have a feminine, yes, would have a feminine texture or kind of appearance, yes.
Yeah, but I mean, I too thought that, well, not necessarily. Why is it feminine? Why isn't it just what those qualities are?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's what I'm hoping a reader might take away from that last chapter. I'm not trying to dispute our one of the greatest minds of modern psychology, but I think we've moved, so much culturally, and of course, he was Swiss, and so you think again about those binaries, Swiss, early 20th century, late 19th century, what he grew up with. Those binaries around masculine and feminine were pretty pronounced, and we're just at a different place in time now.
Exactly. Very well put. Well, we've come to the end. I don't want to say that cliche. We've come to the end of our time today. But we've come to the end of our time today, Dr. Tyminski. I was wondering if there was anything else that you would like to say that we haven't covered yet.
I just want to thank you so much for really, I mean, it's really a delight to be interviewed in such a thoughtful and really attentive way. I so appreciate your kindness in that.
Oh, and I appreciate you saying that. And you do have another book about stealing and theft, and I would love it if sometime you would come back and we could do an episode about that because it's fascinating.
It sounds like a terrific idea. I'd be happy to.
Oh, great. Well, thank you again for your time today. Please visit the website Speaking of Jung, that's JUNG.com, for more information on everything that was discussed here today. There you'll also find all of the previous episodes of this podcast, which are available to listen to or to download for free. This podcast is also available on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, or wherever you get your shows. You can help support this podcast at no extra cost to you simply by shopping at Amazon.com through any of the book links on our website, or by registering through our links for any of the online video courses offered by the Jung Society of Washington, D.C. You can start these courses at any time, go at your own pace, and you'll have lifetime access to the material. Please look for the links to all 3 courses on the front page of our website. With special thanks to Routledge, this is Laura London, and you've been listening to Speaking of Jung.